This is Paris Hoover, your Patton University online course instructor for this semester. Unit 1, Introduction. Have you ever played the lottery? For a small amount of money, you can buy a chance at getting rich, but you buy a very, very small chance. The lottery is perhaps the ultimate high-risk, high-return, short-term investment. The risk is so high that no matter how many times you play, it's almost guaranteed that you'll never win. But nonetheless, people keep buying them. Why? It's the psychology behind the investment. Even though you're virtually guaranteed not to win, the small outlay of funds against the chance at huge sums of money has a very strong psychological pull. In terms of traditional investment, at a very basic level, whenever someone invests, he or she expects to receive a return on that investment, be it through appreciation, interest, increase in stock valuation, etc. The investments are tied to an expected rate of return, money gained from the investment over a particular period of time, and an expected level of risk. Short-term investments with high returns are generally the most risky, while long-term investments with low returns are the most stable. In this unit, you'll examine different kinds of personal investment and financing, while exploring the psychology that underlies them. You will develop a better understanding of the motivations that drive investment and the considerations that govern financial decisions on a personal level: time, money, and risk. Finding that combination of these you can best tolerate is a core aspect in personal finance. Learning objectives. 1. Analyze the purposes and constraints of personal financial decisions. 2. Evaluate personal budgeting, long-term financing, insurance, and the nature of investment risk. 3. Compare the cognitive and emotional aspects behind the psychology of finance. Continue to Objective 1. Welcome to your textbook, pages XXIV through XXVI. Preface. This book approaches personal finance from an investments perspective and investments from a personal finance perspective. Texts in the area of finance tend to be either on corporate finance or investments. However, the appropriate dichotomy may be between corporate finance and personal finance. Text on personal finance would cover investments as the current one does. In the future, text may emerge covering other aspects of personal finance, such as saving and debt. The present text pays some attention to saving and debt, but the emphasis is on investments. This emphasis stems largely from the fact that there is far more academic literature on investing than on saving and borrowing. There are few texts available specifically on personal finance with coverage of savings and debt, but unfortunately they tend to be at a relatively elementary level of analysis with little reference to academic literature. The current text differs from other texts on investments in a number of ways. 1. It recognizes that investing is a behavior which can be analyzed from the perspectives of a number of disciplines. Many investment texts are based solely on the financial economics. When they allow other discipline into the analysis, it is typically by means of a separate chapter or section of a chapter on behavioral finance. This entails a consideration of the implications of cognitive psychology. The present text does not separate behavioral finance into separate chapters, but integrates it into many aspects of investing. It also goes beyond cognitive psychology and introduces the significance of a number of other disciplines, such as social psychology, sociology, accounting, macroeconomics, politics, demography, gerontology, media studies, and marketing. 2. It uses less mathematics than most other texts. Although mathematics can provide rigor, it can also be a barrier to communication. Many readers find mathematics impenetrable and can lose sight of the fundamental principles by being distracted by mathematical methodology. Furthermore, mathematics can limit discussion to the measurable dimensions, whereas many important aspects of personal finance and investing are not measurable. 3. There has been an attempt to integrate the most recent literature into discussion so that readers become acquainted with the most recent ideas and evidence. 4. The text recognizes that personal finance is about money management. Correspondingly, the concepts and principles covered are related to the money management problems of individual investors. 5. Many of the investment theories are illustrated by numerical examples. 6. The text has UK orientation. Whilst non-UK residents can use the text to learn about the principles and processes of personal finance and investments, the institutional examples are UK-based. However, about 95% of the text has universal relevance. 7. There are chapters dealing with issues that are important but rarely given emphasis in other text. Examples include the psychology of financial decision-making, stock market bubbles and crashes, the significance of institutional investors, the purposes and processes of regulation, property, investment and finance, and alternative investments such as structured products and hedge funds. 8. The text recognizes that most investment at the personal level is carried out through institutional investors. Consequently, there is much more emphasis on institutional investors than is typically the case with other investors. Please continue reading to page XXVI. Chapter 1, Introduction, pages 1 through 12. People save and invest for various purposes. For holidays, home improvements, cars, deposits, for house purchase, children's education, old age, and general security. Some of these are short-term objectives, and others are long-term. The single biggest long-term objective is usually the provision of a retirement income. The time horizon of the investment will influence the nature of the investment. Savings for a holiday are unlikely to be put into a risky investment such as shares. Saving for a pension is unlikely to be low in return investments, such as bank or building society accounts. The largest investment item for many people is their pension fund. At an annuity rate of 8% per annum, a pension of £200,000 a year requires a pension fund of £250,000. Whether a pension is being provided by an employer or being funded by the employee, a substantial sum of money needs to be accumulated, so successful investing is vital. The need to invest for retirement is becoming increasingly important as governments progressively back away from promising adequate state pensions. In Europe and North America, as well as elsewhere in the world, the proportion of retired people in the population is rapidly increasing. This is often called the demographic time bomb. In the UK, for children born in 1901, the average life expectancy was 45 for males and 49 for females. Those born in 2002 had an average life expectancies of 76 for males and 81 for females. Life expectancy is steadily increasing, and with it, the average period of life in retirement. The result is a rising ratio of pensioners to workers. It is often seen to be unrealistic to expect those working age to pay the increasingly high taxes needed to pay good pensions to members of the retired population. One answer is to encourage people to provide for their own pensions by accumulating pension funds during their working lives. Page 2. According to a World Bank publication, the percentages of the populations of the UK, Germany, and France over 60 in 2000 were 20.7%, 20.6%, and 20.2% respectively. They expected percentages for 2030 were 30.1%, 36.35%, and 30% respectively. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in Western Europe, the ratio of people of retirement age to those of working age was about 0.15 in 1950. By 2000, it had nearly doubled to 0.29. It is projected to approximately double again to about 0.64 by 2050. The ratio of pensioners to people working age would have risen from about 1 to 6 in 1950 to around 4 to 6 in 2050. It is clearly unrealistic to expect those of working age to be able and willing to pay sufficient taxation to provide so many retirees with adequate pensions. Table 1.1 shows some of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development figures that illustrate the aging populations in a number of countries. There is also the issue of how to invest. Stock market investments, particularly shares, are seen by many people to be too risky. However, historically, shares have massively outperformed other forms of investment, such as bank deposits. The issue of relative risk needs to be seen in relation to the investor's time horizon. The picture from a 40-year perspective is very different from that of a 1-month perspective. Investments in shares can benefit from time diversification over a long time span of good periods, can balance out bad periods. Also, from a long-term perspective, the accumulated income from investments becomes more important in determining the final sum accumulated. For example, £1,000 invested at 4% over 40 years will grow to £4,801, whereas 8% it would grow to £21,725. The income receipts from stock market investments may be more stable than the interest receipts on bank or building society deposits. According to the Barclays Capital Equity Gilt Study, £100 invested in a balanced portfolio of UK shares in 1918 would have grown nearly £420,000 by 1998. An investment of £100 in Treasury bills over the same period would have grown to less than £2,500. These represent the rates of return approximately 11 PA to 4% PA respectively. When allowance is made for the effects of inflation on purchasing power of money, the average rate of return from bank to building society deposits has not been far above zero. The message seems to be that the accumulation of wealth over long time periods, such as periods typically required for the accumulation of pension funds, requires investments to be made in stock markets. Please continue reading to page 12. Chapter 2, The Psychology of Personal Investment Decisions, pages 13 through 22. Choice under constraint. When making personal investment decisions, investors seek to achieve objectives whilst taking account of their circumstances. Objectives would include obtaining a high rate of return on their investments and the avoidance of substantial risk. Another objective might be the maintenance of adequate liquidity. Another could be the receipt of a high and stable income without resort to selling or cashing in investments. Relevant circumstances are many and varied. Table 2.1 lists some relevant circumstances. This chapter will consider these objectives and circumstances in turn. First, however, the impact of various personal characteristics and circumstances will be illustrated by Table 2.2, in which a plus sign indicates a favorable disposition toward a particular characteristic of an investment, and a negative sign indicates an aversion to a feature of an investment instrument. Objectives. The objective of high rate of return is based on the view that it is better to have more money rather than less. A high rate of return means that when an investment is eventually sold or cashed in, the sum of money received by the investor is relatively large. Return compromises both income yield and capital gains. The objective of liquidity relates to the speed and cost of turning an investment into cash. A liquid asset is one that can be transformed into cash quickly and at little cost. An illiquid asset is one that cannot be converted into cash quickly and which may require the investor to accept a low price in order to find a buyer for the asset. Many investors depend on their investments to provide income. Although income could be obtained by selling investments, there may be reasons for not doing so. One reason may be the avoidance of the possibility that selling investments could jeopardize future income receipts. Never touch the capital is a rule of thumb that aims to preserve the source of future income. Another reason might be that an investment is indivisible. For example, the ownership of a house for the purpose of obtaining rental income. It is not possible to part sell the house to augment rental income. Types of risk. Low risk is probably the most complex and multifaceted of the objectives. This is largely because risk has many dimensions. It has been suggested that there are more than 20 forms of risk that an investor may face. Some of the more important risks will be mentioned here. Market risk is the risk that a value of an asset falls because of generalized decline in asset prices. For example, the price of a share may fall as part of a general decline in the stock market. Market risk is a form of capital risk. Capital risk is the risk of reduction in the value of an investment. Market risk is alternatively known as systematic or non-diversifiable risk. Non-systematic risk is the risk that the value of an investment may fall as a result of factors specific to that investment. For example, the price of a company's shares may fall because a competitor begins to offer a superior product. Non-systematic risk is alternatively known as specific, diversifiable risk. It is called diversifiable risk because a well-diversified portfolio shares should eliminate such risk. Or diversifiable risk. It is called diversifiable risk because a well-diversified portfolio of shares should eliminate such risk. An increase in interest rates tend to be accompanied by declines in asset prices. This relationship is particularly reliable in the case of long-dated bonds. A bond is an investment that typically pays the investor a constant sum each year and then repays the original investment on a maturity date. If the interest rates on other investments rise, bonds become relatively less attractive and their prices fall. The impact of interest rate changes increases with the maturity of a bond. This is a form of capital risk, which is the risk that the value of an investment may fall. Interest rate changes are also associated with income risk. Income risk is the risk that the income receipts from an investment will fall. A long-dated bond has little income risk since the coupon receipts are known with certainty until the maturity date of the bond. On the other hand, a bank or building society deposit has high income risk. As short-term interest rates fluctuate, so too will the interest payments to investors. A source of both capital and income risk on bonds is default risk. This is the risk that the issuer of the bond fails to make coupon payments or fails to repay the principal amount on the maturity date of the bond. A related risk is credit risk. Bonds are given credit ratings by the credit rating agencies. The ratings are intended to indicate the likelihood of default. If the credit rating of an issuer or bond is reduced, the market price of the bond will fall. A A form of both capital and income risk is inflation risk. This is a risk that general price inflation erodes the purchasing power of value of an investment and the income derived from that investment. This is alternatively known as a purchasing power risk. Currency or exchange rate risk relates to the investments denominated in foreign currencies. If the currency in which a foreign investment is priced falls relative to the investor's own currency, the value of the investment and income from it will fall in terms of the investor's own currency. Political risk is the risk that governmental decisions will adversely impact the value of investments or the income from them, since the income relevant to investors after tax income. Changes in tax rates are a form of political risk. World event risk is the risk of events impacting negatively on investments. The terrorist attack of 11 September 2001 provide an example of such risk. Liquidity risk is the risk that becomes difficult to liquidate an investment. If buyers for a particular investment become scarce, it will become difficult to sell, at least without having to substantially lower the selling price. So risk is varied in nature. The objective of achieving low risk may need to address a large number of different risks. Please continue to page 22. In Objective 3, we will cover pages 23 through 52 of Chapter 2. Page 23, the psychology of personal finance. Many retail investments are stock market related. These include pension funds, individual savings accounts, unit trusts, and investment bonds. It is desirable that decisions relating to stock market related investments should be made rationally. Psychological research has indicated that there are biases in decision making. These biases have implications for the decisions as to whether to invest in stock market related products, the extent of such investment, and the nature of the investments. These biases could cause investors to make poor decisions or financial advisors to give poor advice. If investors understand the psychological biases to which they may be prone, they may be able to compensate for them when making investment decisions. If a financial advisor knows the psychological biases that affect clients, the advisor can try to offset those biases by appropriate information and advice. Whilst a financial advisor should discover and accept a client's preferences, the advisor should attempt to dispel misperceptions and misjudgments that arise from the client's psychological biases. Simultaneously, advisors should guard against the biases to which they themselves may be prone. Psychological research has found a number of systematic biases that affect investors. These include overconfidence, hindsight bias, representativeness, conservatism, narrow framing, retrievability, and ambiguity aversion. In addition, social influences and moods affect investment decisions. All of these biases interfere with the process of rational decision making. Psychological factors can be divided into self-deception, heuristic simplification, social influence, and emotions. Some psychological influences may belong to more than one of these categories. Self-deception. Self-deception is the process whereby people exaggerate their abilities. People tend to think that they are better than they really are. One psychological bias is overconfidence. Overconfidence arises partly from self-attribution bias. This is a tendency on the part of investors to regard successes as arising from their expertise, whilst failures are due to bad luck or the actions of others. This leads to excessive confidence in one's own powers of forecasting. It is capable of explaining a number of types of apparently irrational behavior. For example, it can be why some investors hold poorly diversified portfolios. If investors are highly confident about their selection abilities, they will not feel the need to reduce risk by means of diversification. It could also explain why some investors trade very frequently, to the point where transaction costs cause their investment behavior to be loss-making. Overconfidence can explain why some investors churn their portfolios, that is, persistently sell and buy. This behavior entails a new set of initial charges each time, with the effect that the investors lose. This churning may be recommended by overconfident financial advisors. Odin has shown that one of the effects of overconfidence is that turnover of investments tends to be high. That is, people trade shares more as a result of overconfidence. Statman found that trading volumes rose when stock prices had recently risen, which is seen as consistent with the overconfidence bias. Overconfident investors trade more frequently following market gains, since they mistakenly attribute their gains to their investment skills. Barber and Odin have shown that as turnover rises, net profits tend to fall. Psychological research has found that men tend to be more overconfident than women. Barber and Odin found that single men trade 67% more than single women. Correspondingly, single men on average experience investment returns of 3.5% per year lower than single women. The hindsight bias is similar to the overconfidence bias, except that it relates to evaluations of the past rather than the future. Fischoff explains that with the hindsight bias, people consistently exaggerate what could have been anticipated. People tend to view what has happened as having been inevitable and see it as having been predictable before it happened. People even misremember their own predictions. Memory is fallible. Azar suggested that if people cannot remember their original judgment, they will reconstruct the recollection of the original judgment in the light of subsequent information. I knew that would happen, and I knew it all along, are statements that characterize the hindsight bias. The hindsight bias is the inability to correctly remember one's prior expectations after observing new information. The hindsight bias prevents people learning from their own mistakes, since they are unable to remember those mistakes. People are unable to recognize their own errors. There is self-denial about past errors. If someone has a self-image of being a clever investor, past errors in forecasting may be subject to distortions of memory aimed at maintaining the self-image. Memory is never a faithful recollection of the past. It is amended by the human mind. Good decision-making in financial markets relies on learning from the past. Learning may entail the comparison of new information with previous expectations. This requires an accurate recall of previous expectations. The hindsight bias involves the contamination of recollections of expectations by new information. The recalled expectations of an outcome are biased towards information about the outcome. The person remembers forming an expectation that is close to what subsequently happened. Another psychological bias, which is related to overconfidence, is referred to as optimism or self-enhancement bias. Most people believe that they are above average. Researchers have found that this belief relates to choosing investments, academic performance, and driving ability. To the extent that some investors attribute profits from rising markets to their own talents, rising markets could be self-perpetuating. Overconfident investors may be encouraged to invest further and thereby reinforce an upward movement in stock prices. Conversely, a falling market reduces confidence in investing. This is consistent with the view that markets exhibit overreaction. They rise too high and fall too low. It helps to explain why small investors tend to buy following market rises and sell following falls. Another bias based on optimism is the outcome bias, which causes people to expect to get what they want. Decisions are made in the expectation that what is wanted to happen will happen. In other words, wishful thinking. An investor may expect a high return on an investment because a high return is what is wanted. This could generate overconfidence and an underestimation of risk. Overconfidence could be based on excessive belief in one's own talents or on the belief that events will turn out to be favorable. In both cases, the investor may underestimate risk when making investment decisions. Some other biases have similarities with the concept of overconfidence. As a result of the confirmation bias, investors pay more attention to evidence that supports their opinions than to evidence that contradicts them. This can bolster overconfidence and cause investors to persist with inappropriate investment strategies. Another cognitive bias is the illusion of control. In some circumstances, people behave as if they were able to exert control where this is impossible or unlikely. The illusion of control, together with confidence, may explain why so many investors choose actively managed funds when tracker funds outperform them and have lower charges. A study by the Financial Services Authority has confirmed the findings of academic studies, which found that the relative past performance of actively managed funds is no indicator of future relative performance. It may be overconfidence in their own selection abilities and the illusion of control provided by the facility of choosing between funds cause investors to select actively managed funds when tracker funds offer better potential value. According to Langer, people often find it difficult to accept that outcomes may be random. Langer distinguishes between chance events and skill events. Skill events entail a causal link between behavior and the outcome. In the case of chance events, the outcome is random. People often see chance events as skill events. When faced with randomness, people frequently behave as if the event were controllable. If people engage in skill behavior, such as making choices, their belief in the controllability of a random event appears to become stronger. There is considerable evidence that investment managers are unable to consistently outperform stock markets. This suggests that the outcome of investment management is random. However, since the investment managers engage in skill behavior, analysis, and choice, they tend to see portfolio performance as controllable. Retail investors and financial advisors are also likely to see performance of their investment choices as controllable. The act of choosing enhances the illusion of self-control. Illusion of control. Self-deception is increased by the distorting effects of memory. Memory is not a factual recording of past events. Memories are influenced by many personality and emotional factors. To some extent, people remember what they want to remember. Inaccurate memories can lead to poor decisions. Gottsman and Pales and Moore investigated the recollection of investors. They found that investor memory of the past performance of their investments was better than the actual performance of those investments. People tend to have self-image of being good investors and want to believe that their investment decisions have been good. The mind perceives the past in such a way as to be consistent with the self-image. The mind feels uncomfortable with information that contradicts the self-image. This is known as cognitive dissonance. The mind will adjust memory in order to reduce cognitive dissonance and maintain a positive self-image. It is not just memory that adjusts in order to maintain a positive self-image. Planning might be adjusted. For example, a young person with a self-image of being fit and attractive might avoid saving for a pension, since the idea of retirement produces a self-image of being old in the future. Please continue reading to page 52.